surely will be made in the next 15 years and the 15 after that. We'll hold tightly Chauvr's message of starting with the end in mind and doing whatever we can in whatever role we're in to shape the future of social enterprise.
We'll remember the panels full of compelling speakers, inspiring dialogues, and invigorating calls to action. We'll remember you, not just passively observing, but actively participating to imprint your own collective character on SECON2014. We'll remember the packed workshops and action labs and idea labs with people crowded around whiteboards, debating ideas and insights and plans. We'll remember you collaborating in ways only some of the highest performing organizations do, after coming from all corners of the world and every possible industry to form a new SECON community. And though we'll hold the memories of this weekend close to our hearts for a long time, we are more excited for what you all will do in the future. And in the spirit of community, we'd love to leave you with some thoughts we've learned this weekend from you.
To those of you just playing with a new idea of social enterprises, we encourage you to take risks, dare to fail, because what matters is what you will learn in the process and how you'll use those lessons to choose success going forward. To those of you working in existing social enterprises, we could say keep it up, but instead we'll challenge you to turn it up. Look for ways to multiply your impact. And even though it's challenging, do your best to work together with other organizations in your field. We stand a much better chance at seeing our visions come true through a coordinated approach.
To those of you who are entrepreneurs, fighting inside your company to enhance its impact. As you saw this weekend, you're not alone, and you will not be alone. Find your allies and focus on the win-wins for your company and for society. To those of you on the edge looking in, welcome to the party. We hope that you've been as inspired as we have after this weekend and are filled with the urgency to act now. We invite you to find a place where you can dive in and add value. The water is warm. We know many of you have only known each other for almost only about 36 hours now, but do not underestimate the impact you've already made on our lab facilitators, our speakers, our Pitch for Change judges, and most importantly, on each other. Please give yourselves a warm round of applause.
We are especially grateful for our sponsors. Like many of your organizations, SECON is a social enterprise itself, and we would not be able to put on this event without the support of Kiva U, Citigroup, Bain & Company, the HBS Social Enterprise Initiative, 7th Generation, USC Marshall, Building Excellent Schools, OMG Foods, and Run It Clean Energy for your trust and generosity. And lastly, we'd like to give a special shout out to the incredibly dedicated HPS staff, our energetic group of volunteers, to the groundbreaking entrepreneurs at Echo and Green, the expert skill builders at General Assembly, and the amazing facilitators and illustrators at the Value Up for being true partners in every sense of the word. You have made this conference shine. Please give it up for them.
It's clear that, on paper, the Social Enterprise Conference has all the resources any conference would need to light it up like SECON2014 has. A brilliant and encouraging university, a long history of excellence that makes the best social entrepreneurs want to speak, participate, and attend. People like you that are willing to give their time, minds, and hearts to this event. But that's not enough to make SECON2014 what it has been. You see, every fall, we start with a legacy of what this conference has done, but not much more than that. Yet here we stand today with a momentous new contribution to add to SECON's history. And it's all due to this team here on both sides of the stage. 33 unbelievably talented, dynamic, and committed individuals have been working for 6 months to curate the inspiring content you experience and organize it all into seamlessly effective operation for you to enjoy. They've put in over 7,000 hours of time and recruited over 1,500 attendees, presenters, and volunteers to be here today.
And more importantly, we've watched them grow into their roles as our team has grown into a family. And after all this is over, the thing that we'll most remember is how a couple of already overworked and overscheduled students came together to produce an event that will send waves of impact to all corners of this earth. So now we invite our entire team to join us on stage. Please come up here and look around at what you put together. So up here we have the 3 student teams of SECON2014, the content team, please raise your hand, your operations team, and your external relations team. To our attendees, whatever SECON2014 has meant to you, these are the people that you have to thank. Please once again show them your appreciation. And now on to the last main event. Mary Hong, our Director of Content Development, will introduce our great last keynote speaker, Jill Dumain.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mary Hong. I'm one of the content directors for this conference. And on behalf of the whole content team, we hope that you really enjoyed your day and that you got a lot out of the diverse programming that we put together for you. Although we come together with a variety of different interests and from a variety of different backgrounds, I think one of the things that we all have a stake in is the earth that we share. Therefore, I'm very pleased to introduce our closing keynote, Jill Dumain, who's the Director of Environmental Strategy at Patagonia, a forward-thinking, California-based outdoor apparel company who has, as part of its mission statement, used business to inspire and implement solutions to the environmental crisis, and which donates 1% of its revenues each year to grassroots environmental groups. Jill is a graduate of the University of California, Davis in textiles and clothing. At Patagonia, she has been involved with several flagship projects, including the company's transition to organic cotton, the Common Threads recycling programs, in which customers can recycle Common Thread labeled products to be processed into new Patagonia products. She has also been involved with the introduction of the Blue Sign technologies for sustainable fabric production, and also the Footprint Chronicles website. In her work, Jill has traveled all over the world, speaking with farmers, fabric manufacturers, and like-minded companies committed to environmental responsibility. In keeping with the conference theme, I'm particularly interested in hearing Jill's reflections on her 25 years at Patagonia, what the company has learned from the past, and more importantly, what initiatives it is taking now to protect our planet in the future. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Jill Dumain.
So I was happy to hear everybody thank all the other speakers because now the pressure's off. I don't have to worry to be good in order to get a good applause. But I do want to thank you for having us here today and inviting Patagonia. And it's interesting to see the other speakers and the other panels that you've had and to look at social entrepreneurship and enterprise. And I attended a conference actually Patagonia puts on that is for grassroots activists maybe 10 years ago. And I said to my colleagues, but I'm not an activist. I'm not pushing people here. And they said, Jill, you are. You've been convincing people to do stuff they haven't wanted to do your whole career. That's what an activist does. And so when I was listening to your comments about social enterprise, I thought, well, I'm a for-profit company. I'm not social enterprise. But actually, when you look at a lot of our practices, as you'll see, I think we're the making consumer products in order to do that. So what I'm going to do, as Mary said, thank you for that introduction. I've been with the company nearly 25 years. May 1st will be my 25th anniversary, which I can hardly believe has happened. It was supposed to be a 2-year stint, and then I was going to move on to do something else, and suddenly it's 25 years later. But I've been very, very fortunate in my positions to really work on a lot of different types of things, try new things, work for a company that's not afraid of failure and not afraid to try things and then change if they don't work. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a history and hopefully a little peek behind the curtain and really looking at your theme of reflecting on the past to shape the future. I feel like I do that constantly in my job every single day because in these fields, things move so, so fast. What was current 6 months ago, 6 weeks ago, isn't necessarily current today. Tomorrow you're going to have a problem that you couldn't even have imagined yesterday. And so it's very, very fast moving, which for people that like that and like change and like that is really fantastic. For people that don't, it can drive me absolutely crazy, and I've seen both happen. So Yvon Chouinard is the founder of Patagonia. It's still a privately held company. That is important in a lot of these things that we'll talk about because it gives us a lot more power to make decisions internally that a public company couldn't do for legal reasons of fiscal responsibility and to their board, the responsibility to their shareholders. So Yvon definitely has a different view than a lot of CEO, or I should say founder owners. Yvon rarely has been the CEO of a company. He knew that wasn't one of his strengths, so he's always had one that has actually run the day-to-day. But they're very, very influential. Of the 4 family members now, Yvon and his wife Melinda and their 2 kids, Fletcher and Claire, are very involved in the company. But when you look at this, you need a healthy planet to have a good business. And I bring that up. You need healthy people to have a good business. And when I speak to different audiences, and I maybe every 3 months get the question, but what's the business imperative of this work? Well, if the planet dies, if the planet isn't healthy, if the planet can't provide resources for what we need to do, there isn't going to be business anyway. So let's take care of the foundation before we try to go to the next level of production. But to give you a little background on how this all started, Yvon was a falconer as a young teenager. And if you talk to him, he says, try moving to California from Maine. Your first language is French and you have a girl's name. And you don't like team sports. So he ended up being a falconer, which led him into climbing, which led him into making his own tools because he didn't like what was on the market. He didn't feel the quality was high enough and the durability wasn't high enough. So he learned how to blacksmith, and I don't know, there's that famous story he borrowed like $274 from his parents, and now he has this very successful company. But here he is making blacksmithing equipment in Burbank in the 1960s. And this is what he made. He made pitons for climbing. Pound them into the rock, tie your rope into the hole, and you can go. Well, that was a problem. It caused, well, let me tell you this one. So he would climb during the summer and surf during the winter, which is why we're in Ventura, California. Most people assume we're in the mountains somewhere, Colorado maybe, but we actually are right on the beach because the waves are good there in January when they couldn't climb. So they would make equipment in the winter and then sell it in the summer. And this is him selling in Yosemite, sometime also in the 60s. And what's important about that is he used his equipment and he sold his equipment to his friends. So if there was product failure, if there was a quality problem, that was a really big problem. So from the very beginning, quality and durability is in our DNA, and it's really a big part of our product and our company. And when I looked at your theme of reflecting on the past, I feel like that has very much dictated a lot of where we've been over the years. But then in the early 70s, we realized the pitons, well, not me, I wasn't there quite that long ago, but they realized the pitons were doing a lot of damage to the rock faces, and they didn't like seeing the places they loved become scarred. So they put the catalog out of clean climbing, and I believe the pitons at the time was something in the neighborhood of 50 to 60% of Chouinard equipment sales. But they decided they had to stop selling them because of the damage it was doing to the natural environment, and instead they introduced a product called Top that didn't damage the rocks. And this was the very first time, as we kind of have reflected in our past over the years, to see where we actually made a very difficult financial and business decision in order to support a better found they were the most durable thing ever. Again, most people are surprised cotton was our first product and not something mountain climbing jacket, but indeed we started in cotton and still use a lot of it. And as Mary alluded to our mission statement, the thing that is unusual about this, it doesn't mention anything about clothing. And so being in the environmental department and working on these projects for so many years, I like to tease our product people. We're really an environmental company. You guys just make product to fund our mission. But they actually twist it around the other way. No, we're a products company. Jill, the environmental piece is the gravy. But what this also does is it allows us to look at different businesses and not just be in clothing and to think of it in a bigger way. What kind of leadership do we want to be with our company? What kind of do we want to do with our actions? And we do use this mission statement on a regular basis. I used to be the director of materials, and during that time I used this a lot, especially the do no unnecessary harm. And those words are intentional because we acknowledge we are doing some kind of harm by being a business. So we can't say the least amount of harm because we have an impact just because we're making something. But if you're looking at no unnecessary harm and put your projects through that and filter through a sentence of that, a lot of things fall out. One example was when I used to be a material, we had a coated fabric and a designer brought to us one that had a metal on the inside for reflectivity and was supposed to reflect your body heat, more warmth, less weight, blah, blah, blah. So, okay, well, what are we really getting for it? How much warmth increase? Can you feel it once you layer it up? Are the field testers seeing it? Is it worth the mining of that metal in order to have a 3% bump in your heat? No, probably not. We decided it wasn't and we didn't use it. So that was one example where we actually didn't use our mission statement in day-to-day work. The other thing that I think is important to acknowledge is, as a company, our environmental reputation really was started by giving money away and having environmental campaigns. This was one we ran a couple of years ago called our Common Waters, and we tried to address campaigns that other companies maybe don't have the ability to or are a little more controversial. So with our Common Waters campaign, we decided we didn't want to focus on clean drinking water. You know, of course, that's a really important issue in the world. Many, many, many good people are working on it. And we just didn't realize, we didn't really think what our voice could add to that space, but instead we concentrated on some more controversial issues. One of them, and I won't go into detail, but was around dams and broken rivers, we call them, and how many dams are in this country that really aren't even necessary anymore. And we have one in our own backyard, just up the road from us in Patagonia. Everybody agrees it should come out. They just don't know how to take it out. And that provides the image. This is a dam up the road from us, and the campaign led into a film that Yvonne Chenard created with his son-in-law, Matt Stucker, called Damnation, and looking at the number of dams in our country. So this is the dam that's up the road from us, and that's not Photoshop. That actually was an activist prank somebody did at night. They went up there with paint buckets, and this is the dam everybody agrees should come out, and their idea was just cut here. So this just previewed at South by Southwest in Austin, so we're pretty excited that it should be going on the film circuit now, but it's really just bringing to light the issue around some of the dams. And I bring this one up because it's a very concrete example of how some of our campaigns can evolve. Mary also mentioned 1% for the planet, and that has been part of our company from the beginning, and we look at it really as an earth tax, that we need to pay back the cost of doing damage to the environment that we can't negate in other ways by changing production methods. But the areas that I have focused on have been around materials. So I have the pleasure of talking to a few materials people here today, and it was my big love coming out of school. And a lot of people in the sustainability schools ask me, well, how'd you get your job? It's like, you really don't want to know. It was a very circuitous route through the materials department, but really gave me the on-the-job education around the environmental work that we did. And one of the big ones was environmental progress with organic cotton in the early 90s. We introduced our first product in 1992 and then made the switch to all organically grown cotton in 1996. And standing here in 2014, that sounds maybe impressive, but when you know the background a little bit of organic really wasn't a word anybody recognized at the time. We almost didn't call it organic cotton because the word didn't have
talked about non-industrial cotton, non-conventional cotton, what would resonate with consumers. But we went ahead with organic because the food movement had started, but it was still very, very small, and really we didn't have equity there. So we had to find cotton all over the world. We source all over the world. And so we tried to find certifiers that were certifying cotton, that maybe were certifying another crop, and engaged in a lot of areas and had to communicate in a lot of different areas that we hadn't worked in before. And this was all before email and the internet. Which I always love to say to a student population, because I get these like stares like, how did you do it? You guys know your fax machine really well, and you use books. And we really did it. And so it was, when I look back on what we were able to accomplish as not a very big company, that's the other thing to remember for all your entrepreneurs that are starting out there. Patagonia has never been a very big company to do this work, especially in the early 90s, especially in cotton. And I used to joke with our spinning mills that we were basically their lunch break. You know, they would do our production while they were having their coffee and then go back to the real production. But it doesn't matter your size if you're committed to your values and you can find a way to do it. And when people often challenge me on, oh, we're too big or we're not big enough, I just kind of look at it as excuses. And you just need to find the partners, in this case, in the supply chain that are willing to work with you. And when people often say I'm too small, I can't do it, I say, okay, have you ever spent the night in a room? Pick a room this size with a mosquito. Is that mosquito too small to keep you up all night long? No, he's going to find you and he's going to keep you awake. But when we made the introduction to organic cotton, we had this great idea. All of our buttons were plastic, and that didn't seem to suit very well with this great new organic material that we were using. So we started to research different options, and we found these toggle nut buttons. And the toggle nut grows in the rainforest, so that was a great combination that the trees have to stay upright and standing in the rainforest in order to grow the nuts, in order to make buttons. So we're supporting non-deforestation in the rainforest. So the toggle nut propagates in the rainforest because it's the right combination of heat and moisture in the environment there. And the nut will get wet, it'll get soft, the heat will come, it'll become brittle, it'll crack open, and a new plant will propagate. Same thing sort of happens in laundry. You put something in at night, you leave it in the washing machine overnight, you put it in the dryer in the morning, and your buttons crack. This was a case we were not successful at all in our endeavor to be more responsible. And we had a huge, huge, huge quality problem with our buttons cracking. And because of our ironclad guarantee of taking back any product we make, we had tens of thousands of returns because of broken buttons, which you can imagine is bad anyway, but when we were launching this new line of more expensive material, it was even worse. So this is an example where we didn't do our homework enough and went to coconut buttons eventually. And then we also, at the same time, we were working on recycled polyester. These stories aren't new to many of you. I know you've studied the company, but to try to give you a little, again, of the backstory of what we dealt with at the time, this green color is actually the color of our first fabric, because back then they couldn't separate the 7-Up and Sprite bottles from all of the clear bottles. So we started with light green and chip color green fabric. And so you can see the colors on your left, they're all darker than the light green. And at the time, we started talking about traceability and how are we keeping track of these things through the supply chain, and the production manager of the mill said, well, that's easy, you guys are the only green fabric running through the mill. So these are some of the examples that we just had to figure out how to just get started, and then things get better. And they eventually figured out how to separate it, and we could have white fabric beginning to start our work. But that also led to an ability to recycle products. So we started with soda pop bottles in the early 90s, and then as time went on, we partnered with a company in Japan called Taishin, and they were able to actually take back fabric. So we started to send product back. We still do today. But we had to educate people, and this is an example of an ad trying to say, hey, you can recycle all of these things you're sort of used to, but also your clothes. Don't throw them away. There's still a lot of textile waste that ends up in the trash. And so this was an example where we could take polyester and make new products, and that's the Common Threads program that Mary mentioned. At the same time, a few years later, we started looking at hemp. And this was a project from Yvonne, and I got this project in, I don't know, about 1995, and again, remember, no internet, no email, and I was trying to find hemp. Well, so you start looking around, and basically everybody in the U.S. was just interested in getting marijuana legal, so they had all their papers and buttons all had hemp and marijuana leaves on it, and even though I've been at Patagonia 25 years, I'm not old enough to remember that hate district of San Francisco in the 60s, which a lot of those vendors assumed I had. All of these conversations just kept going back to the marijuana culture. Nobody wanted to talk about hemp as a textile and fabric. We ended up finding some in China, and it was an industry that was still alive and well there. But that was an example of finding a crop that uses less water, uses less pesticides naturally, or just by the nature of the crop, I shouldn't say naturally. And we've been using it ever since. It's still a bit of a fringe fabric, but actually it's done quite well for us in the market. And then on the labor side, the people side of it, Patagonia has always been known more as the environmental, and quite honestly and admittedly, we've had to push a little bit into management, the people side of it, and this notion that even if you fix all the environmental problems, it still doesn't solve the people issue. And I'm happy to say there's been a lot of progress around this in the last 5 to 10 years at the company, and this is an example of an organization that we belong to. And they hold us to very strict guidelines, and we actually have to pass an audit they do of us, not unlike we do of our supply chain members. So it's always a bit of a stressful time when they come, making sure that we have all of our ducks in a row in the same way. And animal welfare. This is something that's sort of cropped up a little bit new for us. I'm sure you guys see these puffy down jackets all over the world, all over your campus like we do all over the world. This was an example of a protest against us in Munich, Germany. And this also comes with growing up a little bit and becoming bigger. You become a bit of a bigger target. And it's not something that we've been used to in our history. We've had very good relationships with nonprofits over the years and civil rights organizations. And this group was protesting our use of down. And we were transparent about our supply chain on our website, so they knew exactly where it was coming from, and they were right. We had signed affidavits from our suppliers that our geese were not force-fed for foie gras production, which is when they gorge their liver to make a French delicacy, and they weren't live plucked. But indeed, we were wrong, and the activist was right. And they came and they protested our store in Munich. What's funny about this, well, it's not funny, but a little bit humorous, is you can see it today, not unlike today, outside, about a little colder temperature. And in Germany, there's really strict laws, and so because there were more than 3 of them, they had to be a certain distance from the store, so they had to be certain far back. But then a few of them left, and the others got a little closer to the door, but they were so cold, our employees invited them in and gave them some tea. They said, oh, you guys actually are pretty nice people. So it was an example, though, where an activist knew more than we did, and we had the ability to either learn or argue, and we learned. And as a result of that, we introduced for Spring 14 our first product in fully traceable down. And for fall, it'll be, all of our line will be fully traceable down. And now we're going all the way back to the parent farm, which is important because these parent geese, they live a few years, and that's the place, if a goose is going to be live plucked, it's probably going to happen. The egg, the chicks that go into the meat market, so it's all byproduct from the meat industry, that they do get slaughtered and then they get plucked. And so now we have a fully traceable supply chain. Yeah, you see cringing a little bit. It's a little hard to decide, it better be live plucked or killed. It's not an easy decision that you can face with on a regular basis. But it is the meat industry, and these would be thrown away otherwise. So this is also trying to use the materials. So this is very, very new. This just got launched last October, and we're really excited to see it happen. And this is probably where we cross over more into the social enterprise type company. Is immediately after we put our standard in place, the sales were phenomenal. We didn't have enough down, and all of a sudden they were pressuring our team to go certify more geese farms. But you just can't do that overnight. You can't switch the supply chain that quickly. It takes quite a bit of research and a lot of time. And the company really rallied and said, no, we can't go back on this promise. We're not going to put in non-traceable down, so figure it out. So everybody got together. They shifted sales, they shifted deliveries, they shifted this, and they were able to use all of fully traceable down. So that was really exciting for it to be put to the test so soon and held up. Another area been a lot more refined, so everybody that had these itchy problems with wool, those have been resolved with these lovely fibers now you can wear next to skin and not itch. This is a project down in Argentina and Chile, conveniently in the Patagonia region. And we started working with them about 4 years ago and trying to work on grasslands regeneration as a means of improving the grasslands because of desertification due to overgrazing from the sheep. So we've introduced, new old holistic management practices, and we're seeing some big increases in different parts of the regions. It's very diverse ecosystems down there. You can have the steppe, which has a lot of water. You can get to the coastal areas, which has less. And so really looking at these areas, but this is actually a reference spot of before and after some of the practices being changed. And it's one of the first projects I've actually seen in my career, and I wasn't even sure I would see this before I hopefully will get to retire someday, of a regenerative project. And not just sustainable, not just getting something a little better, not just getting something a little bit back to its, like organic cotton. It's still in the face landscape, but it's better than conventional cotton. This is actually regenerating grasslands. So it's a really exciting project. We're starting, thank you. The farmers are excited. It's in the early stages. It's not perfect, but they all say we'll never go back to the old way. So it's pretty phenomenal to actually have something where the more business we can get there, the better off they're going to be. The one challenge right now is the demand for it. We had a goal of 6 million hectares, which is about 15 million acres of grasslands regeneration. And I think we're at about 1.2 million right now, but only about 15% of that goal is being sold under the certification. So that means 85% of the wool the farmers are raising, they're not getting any kind of premium for. So now I'm going to learn more about marketing and learn about how to talk to my competitors more to try to sell this wool to them. Altruistically, it's going to help the grasslands. Selfishly, it's going to keep my program alive. We're not big enough to maintain it. We've converted all the wool that we can at this point, and we're still coming up short. I put these pictures of the guanacos because they are often considered pests down there. And this is also a project around biodiversity. So the Nature Conservancy has been working with us along with this for-profit company in Argentina. And the Nature Conservancy has really brought in the biodiversity piece, which has been very, very challenging with all the work around index and measurement systems around biodiversity and land use. So this was the first time we were able to actually do wildlife counts as well. A new wetsuit is being grown from a plant called guayuli, which is native to Mexico, grown in Arizona, very low water use, in the process of being converted to organic. And it's, I think, 60% Ulex is the product, is the name of the rubber that's made from the guayuli plant in the wetsuits now. It's not in all of our wetsuits, but we started. And that was, I had a conversation with somebody before the talk, and it's hesitation companies have to introduce a product that isn't deemed perfect. So should we have waited till we could do 100% and not have any petroleum in there? Should we wait until all of our wetsuits can be made in this material? Should we wait until everybody can afford it? And we have learned over the years, just start somewhere. Even if you have one plant-based wetsuit and the rest are all neoprene, your customers aren't going to not buy your neoprene from petroleum. They're going to be happy for the choice. Some of them are going to choose for different performance reasons, but we've learned that time and time again. Introduce one organic cotton t-shirt. It's not going to make all the others look bad. Your customers are just going to be happy they have a choice. And seeing that you're doing something. I think that's one of the biggest things when people get started in some of this work is, I need to wait till I'm big. We already covered that. I can't do it because I can't do everything. They don't care. They just care that you're trying to do something. And for all of you that are just starting or thinking about starting when you leave school, start at the beginning because it only gets harder as you get bigger. Right? I always tell students, right now you all know how to live cheap. That goes away both in your personal life and your professional life, not too long after school. And so take advantage of that ability right now. And as you're starting companies or or working within a company, take it step by step. Don't feel like you have to do everything overnight as well. I think, you know, I've been at the company 25 years. Patagonia's been working on it a long time. I'm thankful for that every day because I think coming into it today, it's a little overwhelming with everything you could do, all the possibilities that are out there. So my encouragement is to just start. Do what you can do and sustain. Don't bite off more that you have to go backwards the next year because that is so deflating to everybody, yourself and everybody around you. So take it just a step that you can actually bite off and digest. And I feel like that's what we've done here. We did what we could do to get the product introduced, and we'll continue to make improvements. And that's definitely a reflection on the past because, like the toggle nuts, we put it on everything. It was a big mistake. Bluesign Technologies is a company we've worked with out of Switzerland, and they have done a lot of work in the diamond finishing part. So we've talked a lot about the beginning of the fiber, where the product begins with the fiber level, whether it's a polymer or naturally grown, of cotton, polyester, hemp, wool. But we have this chunk in the supply chain around diamond finishing that is really can be very detrimental. And some of you might have seen Greenpeace has been campaigning against it in a pretty concentrated effort against the textile industry around a certain class of chemicals. And Bluesign is an input model. So they look at chemicals before the mill introduces them and not trying to clean them up from the end of pipe. And this is what was really attractive to me when I first met Bluesign. And in full disclosure and transparency, I just sit on their advisory board and we'll be at that meeting next Monday. But it was a godsend to me when I was in the materials department. And this was, again, we were a smaller company. There was no way we had the staff or chemical engineers to do it. So finding a partner on the outside that we could basically outsource it to. And in my opinion, they have the strongest standards of anybody in the industry that they're working with. And they also work with chemical companies. And why that's really critical and important is the chemical companies are where legislation is coming down the pipe all over the world. So as a smaller company, you don't have to look to see what Norway or Poland might be introducing next year. And then the chemical companies feed into Bluesign. And then they work off of a list of chemicals they've approved, and it's a lot less headache for somebody in production. Fair Trade Certified. We are very proud to announce our first Fair Trade product will be coming out this fall. And you'll notice this is the sewing label. So it's a little bit different than when you see it on coffee or chocolate right now. And traditionally, the Fair Trade model has always gone back to the farm. This is a new model that Fair Trade USA is introducing where you can do it in components of the supply chain. And this kind of goes back to the conversation just a second ago of starting somewhere, starting where you can. We've talked to Fair Trade for quite a long time, and when they were requiring us to go back to the cotton fields and then use their textile manufacturers all the way through to our end product, it just didn't work. It just was too much complexity to shift the whole supply chain for an initiative internally. But when they started to segment it and let you go in piece by piece and then eventually grow it out, it's really exciting. So we started with a factory in India with the sewing only, and we just made our first payment to the workers. And for those of you who don't know how Fair Trade works, what's so exciting about this is there's a percentage of your production, money-wise, that gets set aside for the workers. The owners can't touch it, the managers can't touch it, it is for the workers of the factory. And it doesn't matter if they sell Patagonia products or not, or the Fair Trade products, it's for the whole factory. And those workers vote on what to do with that money. They can take it as a bonus. They can buy a school bus so their kids can get to school. They can build a library. They can do with it whatever they want, whatever benefits their community. So we're really excited to start to see what kind of projects start to happen from a social perspective in the communities where we do business. And then I mentioned this a minute ago, the Footprint Chronicles, and Mary did in her introduction as well. This was our foray to trying to increase corporate transparency, and this was about 7 years ago now. Wow. And at the time, transparency was, well, transparency is still scary. It's always scary. So don't think we aren't scared by it. It's not comfortable, but it's necessary. And at the time, there was just kind of companies flirting with transparency. I feel like you can't pick up a business journal today without some article mentioning corporate transparency and the importance of it, which is fantastic and really exciting. But when we launched this website, I had people say to me, oh, Jill, it's great, but don't show my CEO. There's no way I want to do that. Or, you know, it's really disruptive in this space. And from a technology and a company practice standpoint, was start to trace all of our products and put them onto, let me go back. Trace all of our products in our supply chains. And Patagonia is a company that's lucky in that we know our suppliers well. We often work very long term with them. We have long relationships. And even if they're new, we visit them several times a year and develop relationships. Often, mostly because we're not an easy customer. We're kind of a difficult customer. We want high quality, we want good performance, we want good environmental things, we want good social practices. And so we're kind of a demanding customer. And you have to know the people you're working with if you have all those demands. But we developed the Footprint Chronicles website, made all these great videos tracing everything, but we found the traffic over there was so low, people weren't going there. So eventually we got the opportunity to go on our selling page, which is here. You can see in the upper, in the upper left there, product footprint tab. And we decided to bring it into the path of the people shopping. And you can click on it and it goes away and you can continue shopping. It's still a pretty low number of people clicking on this tab. So it's a project right now that's a little bit in a holding pattern because we need to figure out a new way to do this. We got a ton of interest from the blog world, we got a lot of student interest, and that was all really great. But the people we want to influence and make their purchasing decisions with this information, they're not really clicking on it. So this is a project that we're still very happy with. We're happy with the precedents that it's set, but it's in need of a little TLC at the moment. The Sustainable Apparel Coalition. So this I want to shift a little bit and talk about how this work is all now shaping the future. So you can see we have 25 years of some pretty successful endeavors, a few flops that were in there. But our world isn't really getting better, right? The consequences are a little more dire. Your winter was really cold, my winter was really hot. Climate change, nobody says anymore, what's it typically like at this time of year? It's like, well, nobody's comfortable really answering that question anymore. So what do we do about that? I mean, all these companies are now gearing up and trying these things. And individual efforts are good, but we don't think they're enough. And we started working in a more collaborative space. We've always worked in a collaborative space, but the Sustainable Apparel Coalition is one of the very intentional efforts to do that. And we've partnered up with, I think, close to 100 companies now. I'm not actually sure what the membership is. Companies coming together to work on bringing the best minds in the textile industry, the apparel industry, footwear, to figure out what is it that we need to do, what can we do better together that we can't achieve individually, and hoping that this is going to make some shifts. And this is the mission statement. You can see a little influence of no unnecessary harm in there, since we were one of the founders of it. But it's trying to understand what are the core issues in our industry and how do we actually make shifts. And I'm really excited to say I think there's somewhere upwards of 30% of the global apparel industry, apparel footwear industry now involved in the Apparel Coalition that have come into agreement to measure in the same way, work with our supply chains in a consistent manner, and try to see if there's some shifts that can happen in this more collaborative space. The other way we're doing this is with B Corps and B Lab. And some of you have probably heard about this. I see a few little woo-hoo. And Patagonia was the first B Corp in California once the legislation was signed in January 2012. And for a lot of people ask, like, why do you guys bother? You're privately owned, you already do all these weird things anyway. But for them, it solidified their commitment beyond them. Yvonne's in his mid-70s now, and he knows he's not going to be around forever. And so what B Corp status does is it ensures the ability of the corporation, no matter the ownership, to consider environmental and social issues and not just financial issues. So it's a really big shift. They don't have public companies yet. Patagonia is the biggest, which we're not often the biggest company in any room. And so it's really an exciting thing to try to bring some attention around it. And the assessment, I will say, for any of you that are in companies or wanting to start one, even if you don't want to go through the full incorporation, the assessment is a very useful tool and it's free. And we have learned a lot. We are creating to-do lists as a result of some of the assessment from the B Corp assessment, along with the once I started working with these groups, because then I could call my colleagues at other companies that were maybe more focused on transportation than we were. They would call me about organic cotton. And you're trading this information that is really in this pre-competitive space. It's before competition has to kick in. And then you're going to compete like crazy when you're in the front of the curtain again, because that's what we are as consumer product companies. But you're competing on performance and style, design, color, customer service, everything else that a consumer product company has. But the collaborative efforts, I would say, have been really, really phenomenal. And you get to learn more about other companies that way. And then the last thing I want to close with is along the same line of what do we do with all these good initiatives everybody's doing, yet we're having not huge shifts in the health of the planet. This is a campaign that we launched a year ago called the Responsible Economy. I always have to stop because you'll go to responsible something. But the responsible economy, and it's really trying to get people to look at consumption and think about consumption, which is a bit taboo for a consumer products company to be standing up and talking about, and could very closely get on the edge of hypocrisy. You just tell us about all these great things that presumably will encourage you to buy our products instead of somebody else's, and now I'm going to say, never mind. Not really. I'm going to say be conscious about it. Think about it. Think about what you do you really need it. And we don't have the answers of what a responsible economy would look like, but this again goes back to the campaign discussion about trying to pose questions that maybe other companies aren't used to the thick skin it requires to do it. And so I especially like this flow chart because I think everybody can relate to it. You see something new, it's really fantastic, you follow it around, and you start again. And suddenly you have this stuff. And I know for me in my life, I like stuff. I do. I'm a hobbyist, I'm a craftsperson, I'm an artist. I have a lot of different mediums, which means more stuff. But it gets to a point it becomes a burden. And where's that balance of too much stuff, storage units we see all over our society, which is kind of crazy. I lived in 400 square feet for 12 years, so I know something about small space living and making do with what you've got. And that was 4 years with my husband, so that was really tight. And you can do it. And I think this is a big quagmire right now for our world to figure out, because as companies are making all these great initiatives and improvements, the earth is still very unhealthy. And I think it's a lot about growth and consumption. And we certainly don't have the answers, but the more we see that. We introduced a program of the Common Threads Initiative prior to the campaign, which when we kind of reflected on it, sort of were the action items to it. And trying to get people to think of these R's, of the traditional ones, for sure, reduce, repair, recycle. Reduce being the hardest one for a consumer products company to talk about, but reimagine being the most fun one to talk about. And for me, that's that whole project we talked about in Patagonia, which is actually being regenerative, which is pretty phenomenal. But then the reduce one was one that we created a bit of stir in with this ad, which I'm sure most of you have seen by this point. But if you haven't, it ran a couple of years ago on Black Friday in the New York Times. And it was meant to jar, it was meant to startle, and what the text reads at the bottom is basically all the impact it takes to make this product. And a lot of that research was done during the Footprint Chronicles era, when we were actually measuring carbon and measuring water, measuring all the impacts that we had. And this was meant to startle, obviously, and it did. Then one of our competitors put this in an ad, Yes, the planet's in trouble, but refraining from buying gear that will keep you warm and comfortable while you're doing what you love to do outside is not going to save it. So that's fun. So it's nice to see there's some people are out there. And then we had a program that we just launched this last fall called Mournwear, and this is really about reuse. So eBay helped us launch some of the reuse things. They're doing a Common Thread store in their website. But if you get a chance, Google Mournwear and the film that was made last summer. It's about 20 minutes, really short, but really sweet, about people reusing stuff to the nth degree. And there's this surfer that lives in Baja, and I think he calculated his shorts cost him a penny a time he wore them because he kept them so long. But it's really celebrating the idea of reusing things and not always buying new. And to follow that, then we ran this ad in the New York Times this last Fashion Week, Better Than New. And looking at what's already there, what can be prepared before you buy. So it's again trying to prompt in some of the more conventional mediums and media outlets some different conversations. Certainly don't have the answers, but to be thinking about this in a bigger way. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Hi everyone, first thank you so much, Jill. Anyone with questions, please, there are 2 mics down at the front. You can queue up. I know we're running a little bit late, but I think since we're very lucky to have Jill here, we can take a couple of questions.
I really like it.
Thanks for your insight. It was really, really helpful.
I really like it.
Originally, I'm from India. What is your stand on GMOs?
Because we have been organic since 96, we don't have any GMOs in our line. And GMOs really came in after the organic decision. So we were fortunate we never had to make the decision, but we wouldn't use GMOs.
So your stand is really that you would not use GMOs?
We would not. Yeah. Sure. Okay.
Thank you for your speech. I have an opportunity to ask a question. For me, your company is regarded as a transformative company, and also the CEO said responsibility for the environment is more essential than sustainability. So for me, your company is really a game changer. So my question is, do you think that differentiation in the competitive advantage is more important than cost leadership, or also equally important?
Sorry, can I one more time?
Do you think differentiation, competitive advantage, is more important than cost leadership?
I think you can't lose competitive advantage because at the end of the day, that's how we survive, right?
Yes.
And so I think there's, like I spoke a little bit about with the Apparel Coalition and working in these collaborative groups, the advantage of working on things in a pre-competitive space is, I feel, critical to solving some of these issues going forward. But then at the end of the day, we are all competitive companies. And so I think what we have found over time is that balance of how do we introduce something and how do we share something. And I was talking to somebody beforehand that Patagonia is a unique position from a size standpoint because we're big enough that you can do a real production run, but we're not so big that it's going to be a huge financial problem if something goes wrong. And so we try to balance it between the two. I don't know if that answers yours. You're welcome.
Hi, thank you for being here. My name is Shahid, and I'm a founder of an organization called Just. We are bringing transparency and engagement to the fashion supply chain, trying to build fully traceable supply chains and then connect that story to the consumer. I think the work that you're doing is incredibly impressive, but we can both agree that the fashion supply chain is really behind on a lot of these things. And I'm just curious to get your thoughts on what you think it's going to take for it to sort of step up in terms of consumer awareness and returning to more sustainable practices, similar to the transition we've seen with the food industry.
Right, right. No, one of my favorite quotes was from a video we did for the Footprint Chronicles. It was a woman saying, "I know more about the chickens that lay the eggs than the people that sew my clothes." There's something wrong with that statement in the society, but it's true, right? You go and you shop for eggs, and you can choose a vegetarian chicken, you can choose a free-range chicken, you can choose whatever. And how do we get that same transparency to people? And the realization of how many hands touch a piece of clothing, that I think is still really unknown. That from the farmer, the gentleman that was just up here growing the cotton, that's some of the hardest work in the world, to the number of hands that touch a piece of fabric before it ends up on a shelf here. So one, I think obviously education always, and you know from reading our website, we try very hard to put that out there. But I also think it's got to be the consumers demanding it from the companies they buy for and asking those questions. Do you know where this came from? Do you know how the workers are being treated? Do you know what's happening in your supply here is a little bit of a controversial statement, but I've made it to other people saying, you know, not only do people say I'm too small to make a difference, companies never say it this way, but it's what I hear, is I'm too big to be responsible. And they don't say it that way. They say, oh, our supply chains are complex, oh, we have 10,000 vendors, oh, we have global production, oh, and to me, it's like you're too big to be responsible. And so I think it's a really big challenge for those big companies to hire enough people to have the ratio, in fact, to do that work and to know their supply chains intimately, which you need to be able to do that. So it's a lot of things I think that have to come together, but a big one is consumers making the choice and demanding that information from the companies they buy from. And I mean, we're certainly not perfect. There's a lot of problems that we still have in our line. And that was one thing with the Footprint Chronicles we got a lot in the blog world was, wow, they're not perfect, but now I trust them. I trust them to tell me the truth because they've told me what's wrong and what's bad. So ask when you're buying, where it came from, what the sources are. Thank you for that.
My name is Ariel Benedette, and I love your product as well as your mission. But kind of, you know, to answer the question you just asked, I don't think that I'm the majority of consumers that care about, you know, its mission as much as the product itself. And for, just as an example, Warby Parker decided that their social mission wasn't selling as many glasses as their style and their actual product. So the mission, they don't market until their third page on the website. And based on your Footprint Chronicle program, you saw that there wasn't much traffic in that area. So I was curious how, as a company, you can push consumers to care as much about the mission as you do. Because you do so many great things, but for a lot of consumers, they care mostly about, you know, the style and the product itself.
Yeah, and that's okay too, actually, because we do sell clothing. So I want it to be the best piece of clothing you ever bought. And I want it to last a long time, and I want you to be really happy with it, and a color that's going to last a long time. And the environmental work really does sort of have to be the gravy, because if you buy something just because it's environmental or social and it's not a good product, it's going to sit in your closet and you're going to go buy something you like. So there is a balance between those two things. And so, you know, I would say in the last 10 to 15 years that I've really been focused on more of, actually 20 years, I guess, it goes back and forth between working with companies. So I think there's a lot of leverage and a lot of levers you can pull within companies. If you get a larger company to make a decision, it's a really big shift in trying to get 500,000 consumers to go buy an organic t-shirt versus Nike deciding to make them. So it's a combination, I think, of working business to business, but then always having that information out there for the consumers to come into it. But even then, it's a bit of a balance. When we first made the switch to organic, we were so motivated by the chemical intensity of conventional cotton that all of our marketing material got processors and chemicals, and everybody was like, oh, I'm like drinking my latte in your store Saturday morning, I don't want to see that. So we had to really change our marketing information and our educational material to allow them to come in where they could digest it. So I think it's a combination of that too, is not backing away from the marketing facts, but not hitting them over their head with them as well, and let them kind of come into it. And that's why I love that chicken and egg comparison, is everybody gets it right away, but why don't we care about the people in the same way? So there's no silver bullet. My common answer is it's just a lot of hard work and persistence in staying at it. Yeah.